They say every kingdom hides a scandal, but this one hid a corpse. And the only person who ever knew the full truth was the princess herself. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the secret she took to her grave. But once you hear it, you'll never unhear it, because it begins with a whisper recorded in the last page of her diary. I buried the body myself, and now it wants to come back. Strange words for a royal daughter. But you must understand, madness wasn't the cause of her confession. Madness was the consequence. You see, in the final years of the kingdom's rule, the palace was rotting from the inside. The nobles pretended everything was fine, lavish banquets, glittering halls, scripted smiles. But beneath the gold and velvet, a darkness crawled through the bloodline. A history of disappearances, cover-ups, convenient illnesses, and heirs who died before they could question anything. The princess grew up surrounded by this silence, the kind of silence that dents a child's mind before she even learns to speak. Every room she walked into fell quiet. Every conversation stopped halfway. Every servant lowered their eyes. Because she wasn't just the king's daughter. She was the last one born in a family that had traded something ancient for power. And one night, a night so still that even the wind refused to breathe, she discovered the truth by accident. It started with a sound under her bed. Not a creak. Not a rat. A dragging. Slow, deliberate, human. Her blood froze. She pressed her ear to the floor, and the moment she heard the second drag, she knew someone was beneath her. Not living, but not fully gone either. Instead of calling the guards, curiosity, that fatal trait of every doomed royal, pulled her toward the source. Behind her chamber wall was a seam she had never noticed, a faint line running along the stone. She pushed, and the panel slipped open like it had been waiting for her touch. Behind it, a staircase descended into darkness, a place never meant for her eyes. She took a candle. She stepped down. The air grew colder. The whispers grew louder. And at the bottom, she found the body she would later bury with her own hands, and spend the rest of her life trying to forget. Most men imagine that when a princess finds a corpse, she screams. She didn't. She went silent. So silent it felt like the darkness around her leaned in to listen. The body lay cold near the far wall of the chamber, as if it had dragged itself there in its final moments. Its fingers were torn, nails broken, knuckles bruised, like it had tried to claw its way out of the stone itself. But here's the part that unsettled her most. She recognized the ring on its hand. A simple silver band, the kind given only to one type of person in the palace, someone bound to the royal family by a vow of deep loyalty. A vow sealed generations earlier. A vow no servant was allowed to refuse. She stepped closer, raising her candle. The flame trembled violently, like it wanted to recoil from what it revealed. The mouth was open, frozen in a final scream so wide it looked unnatural, like the jaw had been broken just to silence it. But the eyes were still wet, not with tears, with something thicker, something dark, something that should have dried long ago. That's when she understood. This body hadn't been dead for months, like the rot suggested. It had been dead for hours. Someone had killed this person recently, and hid them beneath her room, knowing she would find them. Because this kingdom didn't make mistakes. This palace didn't leave loose ends. Everything was a message. And this message was carved in cold flesh. You are next. A sudden gust extinguished her candle. Darkness swallowed the chamber, and in that moment, she heard it, a faint exhale. Not hers. Not the wind. The body moved. She froze. Her breath trapped in her throat. Her hand shaking so violently she thought her bones might crack. The body's arm slid an inch. Just an inch, but enough to change a life forever. Instinct took over. She grabbed the corpse by the wrists, hands ice cold, skin peeling beneath her fingers, and dragged it toward the far corner. She didn't know why. She didn't know what force controlled her limbs. She just knew one thing. If she didn't hide it, someone else would hide her beside it. She found a loose stone in the floor. Lifted it. A cavity waited beneath. A grave already prepared. She shoved the body inside. Stone scraping bone. Flesh folding in unnatural angles. Her breath breaking into sobs she refused to acknowledge. She put the stone back. Pushed it down with all her weight. And when she rose, she felt something watching her from the darkness. Something she couldn't see, but could feel, like the air itself had grown teeth. That night, A princess hid a body, and it was the last night she ever slept without hearing footsteps beneath her floor. She thought burying the body would end the nightmare. But in kingdoms built on lies, nothing ever stays buried. By sunrise, the palace had shifted. Not physically, but in that strange, invisible way you feel when someone has already decided your fate. Servants avoided her eyes. The guards at her door had changed without explanation, and the queen, normally distant and cold, watched her with the quiet interest of a hunter who has finally found fresh footprints. The princess tried to act normal, tried to steady her trembling hands during breakfast, tried to swallow food that felt like it scraped her throat raw. But her mind would not let her forget the weight of the corpse, the cracking joints, the unnatural cold. The moment its arm moved, a hallucination, she told herself. A panic-induced trick of the mind. But deep down, she knew better. Because when she returned to her chambers after sunrise, she heard something impossible, tapping. Soft, rhythmic tapping. Coming from beneath the floor. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. Like a code. Like someone trying to speak without a tongue. Her stomach tightened. Each tap vibrated through her bones. She could feel it, not just hear it. And then, footsteps approached her door. Heavy ones. A guard entered. Not one she recognized. His armor bore no sigil, an unmarked soldier, the kind used for unclean work. He bowed too deeply, spoke too softly. Your Highness, the king requests your presence. Immediately. She followed him down the corridor, every instinct screaming run. But running in a palace was admitting guilt. Running in a kingdom like hers was a death sentence. The hallways felt longer than usual, colder. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to stare at her with knowing eyes, as if they too had buried bodies and lost their minds trying to forget. When they reached the throne room, the doors closed behind her with a thud that rattled her spine. The king didn't look at her at first. He was gazing at a document, a sealed parchment bearing the royal crest, but burned around the edges. Daughter, he said, finally raising his eyes. Eyes too calm, too practiced. Last night, you were awake, were you not? Her pulse spiked. How do you? He cut her off with a single gesture. Things walk these halls that should not. And you, child, have seen something you were never meant to see. She felt the room shrink around her, her throat closing. The king leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper colder than the chamber where she found the corpse. Tell me, where did you hide the body? The world stopped. The king knew. He had always known. And now, she understood the real truth. She wasn't being questioned. She was being tested. The throne room suddenly felt colder, as if every secret ever whispered within these walls were exhaling at once. The king's eyes fixed on her, unblinking, patient, and terrifyingly certain. He was not a father asking his daughter a question. He was a sovereign interrogating a breach in the bloodline. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. Father, do not lie, he murmured, rising from the throne with the steady grace of a man accustomed to control. Not to me, and not to the forces listening beneath your feet. She staggered back. Forces. Listening. The tapping she heard earlier flashed through her mind, followed by the ghost-cold touch of the corpse's wrist in her hands. Her legs trembled. How did you know? She whispered. The king didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, his robe dragging across the marble, the embroidered symbols around its hem glinting in the dim light. Symbols she had always mistaken for decoration, but now, looking closely, they looked like seals, bindings, warnings disguised as art. Because, the king said softly, every monarch before me has had to do what you did last night. Her heart lurched. What are you saying? That chamber, he continued, was built during the first reign, a place for holding what should never walk the earth, yet never be allowed to rest, and every heir is eventually confronted with it. Her breast grew shallow. You mean, the body was not a man, the king cut in, voice chillingly calm. Not anymore. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. The memory of the body's arm sliding, the impossible movement, made her skin crawl. But why me? She asked, tears brimming with confusion and fear. Why now? The king's expression hardened. Because the kingdom is weakening. The seals are thinning. And the old pact requires a sacrifice every generation. He paused. Yours came early. Her vision blurred. Her knees buckled, but she refused to collapse. What pact? He leaned in until she could feel the coldness of his breath. There's a reason our lineage survived plagues, invasions, famines, while every neighboring dynasty fell. We owe a debt that must be paid. And the thing you buried, it was part of that debt. The princess felt her chest tighten, panic clawing at her ribs. And now, the king whispered, because you interfered, it remembers you. Her blood ran cold. The doors slammed behind her, locked from the outside. She was not being protected. She was being contained. Fear hits a person in two ways. First, like a cold wave. Then, like a question that has no safe answer. The princess stood frozen in the sealed throne room, her father's words echoing in her skull like a curse she didn't know she had inherited. It remembers you. The king began circling her slowly, as if observing a specimen, not comforting a daughter. His every step measured, his silence heavier than stone. You touched it, he finally said. You carried it. You sealed it. And now the bond is formed. Bond. A word that felt wrong in her stomach. She shook her head. No, I didn't bond with anything. I was terrified. I only did what I thought would save you. The king laughed under his breath. A quiet, empty laugh. Child, nothing saves you from what sleeps beneath this palace. He walked toward the window, the tall, iron-framed one overlooking the courtyard where executions once took place. Do you know why this palace has no crypts? He asked. Why we burn every corpse instead of burying it? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The king turned back to her. Because buried things rise here. A shiver sliced through her spine. So the body, she whispered, was alive. It was neither alive nor dead, he said. It was a vessel, a reminder, a punishment for breaking the pact. Her throat tightened. What pact? What did our ancestors do? The king hesitated, for the first time showing something close to fear. He lifted his hand, pointing toward the floor beneath their feet. Long before our family wore crowns, they wore chains. They were the servants of something ancient beneath this land, something they could not defeat, only appease. And so they offered bloodlines, souls, memories. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. And when one of those offerings attempted to escape centuries ago, it was trapped, bound in a body, locked in that chamber. And every generation, it chooses someone to haunt. Her breath faltered. Me, she whispered. Why me? Because you opened the door, he said. And the pact sees curiosity as permission. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the distant groan of old would fill the air, a sound that didn't belong to the room. Then the floor vibrated. Barely, but enough. The princess grabbed the arm of the throne to steady herself. The king exhaled gravely. It has found the stone you used to hide it, he whispered. And when it climbs out, it will come for the last person who touched it. Her stomach dropped. Father, what do we do? The king looked at her with a sadness colder than his cruelty. We don't run. We don't hide. He paused. You endure. The floor shook again, this time harder. Closer. Something was coming up. The vibration beneath the throne room floor grew stronger, a slow rising tremor that felt less like movement and more like breathing. Ancient, hungry, patient breathing. The princess stepped backward instinctively, her palms slick with cold sweat, her pulse thundering so loud she feared the thing below might hear it. The king didn't step back. He simply closed his eyes, as if preparing himself for pain he had carried his whole life. It is waking Philly, he murmured, and for the first time she heard fear crack through the layers of authority in his voice. The floorboard shifted again, dust drifting down like ash as a long, low groan rolled through the chamber. Father, we can escape. There must be a way out, she pleaded. But the king shook his head sharply. Doors do not stop it. Walls do not stop it. Once it marks you, it follows. She felt her stomach twist. The tremor intensified, pulling at the edges of her sanity, stirring memories she didn't want, dragging the corpse by its wrists, the way its joints cracked, the impossible slide of its arm. The king leaned closer, gripping her face with both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen carefully. What comes for you is not the creature itself. It does not need to touch you to destroy you. It feeds on Memory, on guilt, on the pieces of you that you tried to hide. That body you buried was not the threat. The threat is the part of you it now wears. She jerked away, horrified. What do you mean, the part of me it wears? Another tremor answered for him, this one sharp, violent, and followed by a single crack from beneath the stones so loud it echoed through the room like a splitting skull. The king swallowed hard, voice trembling. When you touched it, when you hit it, it tasted your fate, your shame, your confusion. Now it carries them. Now it knows how to reach you. The flaw bulged upward, just an inch, just enough to warp the stone. She screamed and stumbled back, hitting the wall behind her. The king drew a thin ceremonial blade from his robe, though his hands trembled too violently for the weapon to be reassuring. If it breaks through fully, he whispered, you must not look at its face. No matter what voice it uses, no matter what memory it shows you. If you look, you lose yourself. The stone cracked again, louder, closer. Something was rising to claim her. The stone finally split with a jagged scream, and a rush of cold air exploded from the crack as if something beneath had been holding its breath for centuries. The princess clutched the wall, her nails scraping against the stone while the king stepped in front of her, blade trembling in his grip, though they both knew steel was useless against something that lived between death and memory. From the fissure rose a sound so unnatural it seemed to scrape the inside of a skull, a soft, wet dragging, like flesh sliding across stone, accompanied by a whisper that didn't echo in the chamber but inside her mind, speaking her name with a voice that sounded like her own breath reversed. She gasped, covering her ears, but the whisper seeped deeper, curling behind her thoughts. The king backed. Do not listen, yet even his command felt distant, muffled by the presence rising from the floor. The crack widened, spreading like the veins of a dying tree, and from beneath the stone emerged a pale, trembling hand, human in shape but wrong in every detail, its fingers too long, its joints bending in gentle, horrifying angles as though it had studied the anatomy of people but never understood it. The princess staggered forward despite herself, pulled by an invisible thread of recognition, because she had held that hand last night, cold, limp, lifeless, and now it moved with intent. The king grabbed her arm, yanking her back just as the creature pulled itself higher, revealing the curve of a shoulder, a neck, and finally the lower half of its face. Not the whole face, only the mouth. A wide, trembling smile carved into its features, stretching too far but carrying a familiarity that made his stomach twist. Don't look, the king shouted, but the creature spoke before she could turn away, using a voice she knew. Her voice. Why did you leave me there? It whispered, and the question hit her so hard she lost her breath. Her mind flooded with the memory of lifting the corpse, the guilt of not calling for help, the shame of abandoning it to darkness, emotions it now wielded like weapons. The king stepped between them, blade raised, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned forward, its almost face inches from the breaking floor, whispering again with a stolen voice, You hid me, but I never left. The stone split further. A full body began to rise, and the princess realized with sickening certainty that it wasn't climbing toward the throne or the king. It was climbing toward her. The princess's breath caught in her throat as the thing fully emerged from the floor, its body twisted in impossible angles, limbs too long and thin, skin pale as marble, yet trembling with a faint pulse that mimicked her own heartbeat. Every instinct screamed to flee, but her legs were rooted, trapped by a fear so deep it felt like gravity had doubled. Its eyes, or the hollow impressions where eyes should have been, locked onto her, yet she felt it seeing not her body, but her memories, her shame, every secret she had tried to bury alongside the corpse. It raised a hand toward her face, each movement deliberate, fluid, mocking the gestures she had once made in innocence. Her father's voice cut through the haze, harsh and commanding. Do not speak. Do not respond. It wants you to answer. She tried to shake herself, tried to scream, but her voice refused to form. The creature tilted its head, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest like water. Then it whispered, her voice perfectly mirrored, a soft, accusing echo that replayed every guilt, every betrayal, every hidden thought she had dared to suppress. Why did you leave me there? It asked again, dragging the question through her mind with claws invisible but piercing. Memories of dragging the corpse, the cold stone against her palms, the smell of decay, all came flooding back in agonizing clarity. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the floor, but the creature followed, sliding with unnatural grace, never touching, yet consuming, as if it were feeding on the very essence of her consciousness. The king lunged, but his blade passed through thin air. The thing was no ordinary body, no mortal being. It existed between worlds, stitched from memory, guilt, and bloodline sin. "It knows you," the king shouted, panic threading his voice, "and now it will not stop until it reshapes you." The princess felt every corner of the room distort, shadows stretching unnaturally, whispers echoing in impossible directions, as the creature rose above her, looming, faceless yet horrifyingly intimate, carrying the weight of centuries of hidden truths, ancient pacts, and forbidden acts of the royal line. She realized with a sick, dawning certainty that this was no accident, no punishment, no mistake. This was the true inheritance of her blood, a curse she could never run from, a darkness she could never bury. And as the creature leaned closer, it spoke once more, her own voice dripping with contempt and despair. "You cannot forget me, because I am part of you now." The room seemed to collapse inward, shadows folding over themselves as if the palace itself were bending around the creature, and the princess felt the walls close on her like a tomb she could never escape. Her heart pounded so violently that she thought it might shatter her ribcage, and every thought she had buried, every secret she had hidden even from herself, was being dragged into the open, illuminated by the presence of something that wore her own memories like a mask. The king stood frozen, his ceremonial blade quivering uselessly in his hands, and for the first time she saw the exhaustion etched deep into his features. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, but preparation did not equate to victory. The creature's whispers grew louder, echoing inside her head, repeating accusations she could not deny. The selfishness, the fear, the moment she had turned away from cruelty she could have stopped, the lie she had told herself to feel safe. Her knees buckled again, and she fell onto her hands and knees, the cold stone cutting through her skates, but the thing above her seemed unbothered by her collapse, moving with a patient inevitability, a predator that did not need to chase because it already had her cornered within her own mind. She could feel the pull of it, not physical, but mental, psychic, predatory, and the whispers became almost a chant, repeating over and over, "You buried me. You left me. You cannot forget." Her vision blurred, tears mixing with the sweat on her cheeks, and she realized she could not run, could not fight, could not call for help. The king shouted, attempting to break the paralysis. "Stand. Resist. You have to anchor yourself to something real." But what was real when the very fabric of memory had turned against her? When the thing that climbed from beneath the palace floor had her voice, her guilt, her face in its mouth, and was dragging her sanity out inch by inch. She clawed at the floor, trying to anchor herself, trying to hold onto the fragment of self that had not yet been consumed, but the creature leaned closer, faceless, intimate, speaking in that familiar, accusatory tone, bending her mind toward terror, bending it toward obedience, and she realized the horrifying truth. This was not a body she had buried, not a ghost, not a spirit, not a punishment. It was the living record of every corruption, every secret, every betrayal of her bloodline, given, formed to test her, break her, and claim her soul. And in that instant, as the walls groaned and the floor threatened to give way, she understood that she was already lost, and that losing was the first step toward transformation. The princess's mind teetered on the edge of collapse, every heartbeat echoing in her skull like a drum signaling the approach of something she could neither fight nor flee. The creature above her moved with deliberate patience, its elongated fingers brushing against the air where her body had been moments ago, and every motion carried a weight of memory, guilt, and unspoken promises she had broken. She tried to scream, but the sound came out as a strangled whisper, swallowed immediately by the oppressive darkness that pressed from every corner of the throne room. The king's voice cut through faintly, taut with authority and terror. "Do not give it a name. Do not speak to it. Anchor yourself." But even as she obeyed, her own thoughts betrayed her, memories of the corpse, the coldness of its flesh, the sound of its joints snapping under her hands, replayed endlessly like a looping nightmare, amplifying her fear until it became a tangible presence pressing against her chest. The floor trembled again, and the creature rose higher, its mouth now partially revealed, horrifically familiar, yet impossibly wrong, and it whispered, not with sound but directly into her mind, weaving images of betrayal, secrets, and the unrelenting history of her family that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries. Every ancestor who had taken part in the pact, every servant who had disappeared, every ritual she had only heard of in whispers now coalesced into a single, suffocating narrative, and she realized she was not just confronting one entity, but the accumulated sins and corruption of generations, incarnated in a being that wore her own essence. Her hand shook violently as she struggled to remain upright, tears blinding her, sweat slicking her skin, and the whispers intensified, circling her mind, probing, testing, dismantling every fragile shield she had erected against despair. The king lunged again, futilely, but she felt a strange, cold clarity amid the panic, an awareness that she could either collapse completely under the weight of what she had unearthed or begin to face it, to stare into the creature's borrowed eyes and confront the truths no royal had dared acknowledge. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet the faceless, intimate gaze, and as the creature's whisper of her own voice repeated, "You cannot forget me," she felt a spark of defiance flare, a dangerous, fragile ember, because knowledge, as terrifying as it might be, was the only weapon she had in a palace built on lies, deceit, and the dark inheritance of her bloodline. The princess forced herself to stand, legs trembling like reeds in a storm, her eyes locked on the creature that had risen from the floor, her own voice now a weapon and a curse echoing in its malformed mouth. The king stepped back, sensing the fragile shift in her resolve, but he did not speak. He simply watched, knowing she had reached the threshold between terror and awareness. Every heartbeat in the room was amplified, every shadow now alive, dancing in time with the dragging pulse of that which had been buried. The creature swayed slightly, as if acknowledging her newfound resistance, yet the air remained thick with the weight of her bloodline secrets, heavy enough to press her lungs shut. Her mind raced through the events of the night, replaying every choice, every hesitation, and she realized something horrifying. The corpse she had hidden was never just a body. It had been a mirror, reflecting every flaw, every guilt, every suppressed truth she had carried unknowingly, now made flesh and intent. She tried to focus, to anchor herself to reality, forcing her mind to separate fear from fact, and in that moment she noticed something she had not seen before. The creature's form wavered slightly, the edges shimmering, unstable, as if it existed not entirely in her world, but also in the world of thought, memory, and perception. The revelation struck her with icy clarity. Her fear fed it, yes, but her awareness could weaken it, her observation could hold it at bay, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of control. She breathed deliberately, each inhale steadying the whirlwind in her chest, each exhale pushing back the oppressive dread that had clung to her like a second skin. The creature's whispered accusations slowed, repeating her failures in a rhythm she could anticipate, and she realized the deeper truth. This entity was not invincible. It was bound by the same rules of attention and memory that governed human minds. If she could master her perception, if she could face it without flinching, it would begin to obey her. Her pulse steadied further, her gaze sharpened, and as the first flicker of defiance ignited fully within her, she stepped closer toward the creature, unblinking, refusing to let it devour her identity, refusing to let the centuries of corruption claim the final heir who had awakened to the truth hidden beneath the palace floor. The creature paused as if sensing the shift, its form wobbling like a reflection in disturbed water, and the princess felt a surge of something she had never experienced before. Clarity sharpened by fear, a terrible lucidity that let her see the bones of the palace, the veins of the old pacts, the weight of centuries, pressing down from the walls themselves. She moved deliberately, her hand steady despite the sweat and trembling that clung to her limbs, and the whispers in her head slowed, repeating fewer words, testing her focus, probing her mind for cracks, for the slightest falter she might offer. The king's eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and terror, followed her every step, recognizing the moment a princess stops being a victim and begins to confront the darkness of her inheritance. The creature reached a hand toward her again, longer and thinner than any human limb should be, but she met its approach with stillness, refusing to recall, refusing to give it the satisfaction of fear. And in that instant something remarkable happened. The whispers wavered, the accusations fragmented, and the connection that had bound it to her memories weakened, ever so slightly, like a cord stretched taut and beginning to fray. She realized that the body she had buried, the thing she had thought was a curse, was in fact a key, a test, a mirror designed not to destroy but to awaken. And if she could endure, If she could remain steadfast, she could reclaim the power the bloodline had once sacrificed for secrecy and control. The creature began to rise taller, the distorted features of her own face fully visible now. Yet she did not flinch. She inhaled deeply, letting every inhale solidify her mind. Every exhale pushed back the tendrils of fear curling around her thoughts. She spoke aloud for the first time since the horror began, voice steady, commanding, cutting through the oppressive chamber air. I see you. I know you. You are not my master. The creature tilted its head, the long limbs pausing midi, and she felt the tiniest hesitation, a flicker of recognition that her awareness was now a weapon. The king whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "She is the heir they never prepared it for." And in that suspended heartbeat, as the shadows quivered and the air itself seemed to hold its breath, the princess understood that the descent into darkness was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more terrifying, far more powerful, because knowledge, once fully embraced, becomes a force no curse can resist. The princess felt the tremor of her own heartbeat in the floorboards, a rhythmic pulse that matched the faint, uneven thrum of the creature's own emergence, and she realized that the chamber itself was no longer merely a room, but a conduit, an artery connecting the past sins of a bloodline with the raw, unbridled force of memory and fear. Every shadow seemed to stretch and coil toward her, alive with whispered fragments of secrets long buried, promises broken, and lives erased. She could feel the weight of generations pressing down, yet something within her responded, a dangerous, delicate flame of awareness that refused to be snuffed. The creature loomed closer, impossibly tall, its limbs moving with unnatural grace, a mockery of humanity. Yet every motion reflected her own suppressed guilt, her own failures magnified and twisted into a living mirror. And she understood that its power came not from flesh or bone, but from the surrender of those who feared it, from the bending of the mind and spirit under centuries of unseen oppression. The king's voice cut faintly through the darkness, tense and urgent. Do not let it rewrite your thoughts. Do not let it claim your soul as it has claimed all those who preceded you. She focused, inhaling sharply, forcing every memory of weakness into a corner, anchoring herself to the clarity that fear had previously denied her. And the creature paused, head tilting as if sensing the shift, a ripple of unease traveling across its malformed body. Her gaze sharpened, eyes locking onto the hollow visage that wore her likeness, and she spoke again, voice steady, resonant, carrying through the thick, oppressive air. I know who you are, and you are mine to confront, not mine to command. The creature shuddered, a low groan emanating from the depths of the floor beneath, and the whispers that had once clawed at her mind fractured into disjointed echoes, struggling to maintain cohesion, while the shadows themselves seemed to recoil, the walls sighing under the strain of recognition that this air would not break. And in that suspended, horrifyingly silent instant, the princess realized that the chamber, the body, the centuries of deceit and terror were all part of a trial not of death, but of awakening, a revelation that the darkness, while ancient and cruel, could be met with clarity, with presence, with the indomitable will of someone willing to stare into the abyss and name it, claim it, and bend its power without surrendering her soul. The first pulse of triumph surged through her, mingled with fear, a dangerous cocktail of awareness and control, as she prepared to descend fully into the heart of the chamber's truth. The air thickened, almost tangible, pressing against her skin like the weight of centuries of unspoken sins, and the princess felt a shiver crawl along her spine as the creature shifted, its form wobbling with the tension of recognition and defiance. Every step she took forward was mirrored by the shadows, every breath she drew seemed amplified in the vast, oppressive silence, yet she did not falter. Her eyes locked onto the twisted reflection of herself, the stolen face, the malformed limbs, and she realized with grim clarity that this was not merely a battle of survival, it was a trial of identity. The whispers that had clawed at her mind from the moment she unearthed the body now became fragmented, repeating fragments of commands, accusations, and memories, all designed to fracture her sense of self, but she forced herself to listen without yielding, to observe without reacting, letting the knowledge sink in that the power of the creature was proportional to her fear and hesitation. The king stood behind her, silent now, watching as the true heir of the bloodline faced a culmination of what had been set in motion centuries before, knowing that this moment, this confrontation, was the fulcrum upon which the fate of the family rested. She extended her hand cautiously, not to touch, but to assert control, to claim presence, and the creature recoiled slightly, its motions jerky, uncertain, as if realizing for the first time that it was not omnipotent, that its dominion over her was contingent on her acquiescence. The whispers faltered, breaking into staccato fragments, repeating her failures and fears with less precision, as the princess drew on every ounce of courage, every memory of past discipline and forbidden knowledge, letting them crystallize into an invisible armor. "You exist because I remember you," she said aloud, voice steady, cold, commanding, and the room seemed to respond, the shadows hesitating, the floor vibrating less violently. The creature froze, suspended in the thick air, and for the first time she realized that she could dictate the terms of the encounter, that recognition of the past, understanding of the pact, and sheer willpower could bend the darkness instead of being consumed by it. The king's lips parted in a rare, quiet acknowledgement, a whisper of approval, as the princess took a deliberate step closer to the entity, her gaze unwavering, a subtle, lethal command radiating from her very being, signaling that the trial had entered its next phase, the confrontation of the soul itself, where fear would no longer bind her, and the abyss would begin to answer to her, rather than devour her. The princess could feel the pulse of the chamber in her bones, each vibration a reminder that the palace itself was a living testament to every sin, every pact, every soul trapped beneath centuries of stone. Yet she stood firm, the first hint of control threading through her terror like a fragile steel wire. The creature mirrored her movements now, slower, more hesitant, as if uncertain whether to strike or retreat, and with every step she took forward, the shadows seemed to shrink, the air growing marginally lighter, though still heavy with centuries of suppressed secrets. She understood, with chilling clarity, that this was not about brute force. The battle was of perception, memory, and the willingness to face what had been hidden, and in this realization she drew a slow, deliberate breath, grounding herself in the truth she had long avoided. The body she buried, the centuries of pacts, the weight of her bloodline, all of it was now hers to command if she had the courage. The whispers rose again, but they were fragmented, pleading, testing her patience, trying to find cracks in her resolve, and she answered by speaking aloud. "I see you. I know what you are. You are a reflection, not my master." The creature hesitated, its unnatural limbs quivering, and for the first time it recoiled, though only slightly, as if unsure how to proceed against someone who no longer flinched. The king's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, as he watched the shift, understanding that the princess was entering a threshold few ever reached, the moment where fear became fuel, where knowledge became weapon, where the darkness could be bent rather than succumbed to. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, not touching but asserting presence, and the entity seemed to respond, its voice, her voice, slowing, faltering, repeating phrases less coherently, as if testing comprehension. She realized then that the chamber, the corpse, the whispers, the pacts, were a crucible designed to forge an heir capable of wielding the legacy rather than being destroyed by it. A surge of icy determination coursed through her veins. She whispered, "You are mine to command, not mine to fear." And the shadows around the creature wavered, flickering like candlelight in a storm, as if acknowledging the transfer of power. The floor trembled one last time, softer now, obedient to her resolve, and in that suspended, terrifying silence, she knew the descent was ending, not in death, but in awakening, and the first symbolic step toward mastery over the darkness had been taken. The chamber exhaled around her, as if the palace itself were acknowledging the shift, a subtle release of centuries of tension and suppressed memories, and the princess felt a tremor of power ripple through her limbs, cold and intoxicating, as though every secret she had unearthed, every horror she had faced, was consolidating into a weapon she could now wield. The creature hovered, wavering, uncertain, its whispers fractured, no longer coherent, repeating snippets of accusation, fear, and betrayal, but lacking the precision and authority they once held. It was testing her, probing her newly anchored mind, yet unable to penetrate the bulwark of awareness she had built. The king remained silent, watching her closely, his eyes sharp, calculating, but carrying a rare trace of hope, a recognition that she had begun to claim her inheritance, that the centuries-old pact and the horrors it had spawned could be faced, mastered, and repurposed. She drew herself taller, shoulders squared, hands steady, and spoke aloud, her voice low, resonant, dripping with the gravity of understanding. "You exist only because I allow it. You feed only on what I surrender, and I surrender nothing. The creature's form pulsed, elongated limbs quivering, the faceless mouth twisting in an expression that mirrored frustration and fear, and she realized with clarity that she had become the anchor, the master of this space, and that fear itself had become her tool, a lens through which she could control what had once controlled her. Shadows flickered and receded subtly, responding to the confidence in her voice, and the whispers broke entirely, replaced by an eerie silence, thick enough to taste, as though the palace held its breath, waiting for her next move. She focused on the chamber floor, the cavity where the corpse had been hidden, and visualized the weight of it, centuries of lies, pacts, and blood, compressing into a single, controllable point, a symbolic act of dominion that did not require touch, only will. The king's lips parted slightly, his whisper barely audible. Speak its name. And she realized that to complete this stage, she must perform a ritual of recognition and control, a symbolic acknowledgement that she now bore the memory, the burden, and the authority of the bloodline. She inhaled slowly, centering herself fully, feeling the shadows bend, the air respond, the pulse of the palace align with her heartbeat, and then, with a deliberate, commanding tone, she began to speak the phrase that would cement the first step of transformation and mastery, awakening powers hidden in plain sight for generations. The princess's voice cut through the thick, heavy air, low, commanding, and deliberate, as she spoke the first symbolic phrase, I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. Each word echoed in the chamber, bouncing off stone and silence, carrying the weight of centuries of secrets, the burden of the bloodline, and the raw energy of fear transformed into awareness. The creature wavered, its form flickering, elongated limbs twisting unnaturally as if caught between dimensions, and the whispers that had once clawed at her mind faltered, confused by the authority now radiating from her. She repeated the phrase, louder this time, cementing her intent, I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. The repetition was not merely vocal, it was mental, spiritual, a deliberate imprint on the very force that had been haunting the palace for generations. She felt the pulse beneath the floor respond to her words, a shiver traveling up through the stone as if the palace itself acknowledged her authority, bending to the recognition of her presence and mastery. The king's eyes narrowed, observing every flicker, every shadow, every subtle change in the creature's posture, understanding that this moment was both a warning and an initiation, that the symbolic phrase was now a binding link between the air and the darkness, transforming fear into a tool rather than a weapon against her. The creature rose fully, towering, faceless, but its movements were slower, hesitant, uncertain, as if measuring the power of the words against the will of the princess who had spoken them. She inhaled deeply, centering herself, allowing the rhythm of her heartbeat to sync with the pulse of the chamber, with the tremor of history beneath the stone, and with the whispering fragments of centuries long past. The phrase echoed once more in her mind, not merely spoken but internalized, engraved into the fabric of her awareness, sealing the first step of transformation and signaling to every hidden force in the palace that the air was no longer a victim but a participant, an active agent in shaping the dark currents that had flowed unchecked for generations. The shadows shrank, the air lightened just enough to allow her to breathe, and the creature tilted its head, unnervingly aware, waiting for the next ascension, the next command of will that would either solidify her mastery or unravel her completely. She stood, unwavering, and in that suspended, charged silence, knew that the descent had reached a threshold where faith, knowledge, and authority converged, and where the next step would test the full extent of her mind, body, and inherited power. The princess felt the air thrum around her, charged with a strange, almost electric awareness, as if the walls themselves were alive, listening, judging, and awaiting her next move, and she realized that this confrontation was no longer just with the creature, but with every secret, every suppressed truth, every manipulation and hidden corruption that had built the palace and her bloodline into what it had become. Her voice, still echoing the symbolic phrase, resonated not only through the chamber but inside her own mind, anchoring her identity against the tidal wave of centuries of guilt, fear, and forbidden knowledge. The creature's form shimmered, its elongated limbs twitching, the faceless mouth pausing mid-whisper as if recalculating, reassessing its strategy against someone who no longer flinched, who no longer reacted out of instinctive terror, but who faced it with deliberate, cold precision. The king remained behind her, silent, a shadowed observer, but the tension in his posture betrayed the magnitude of the moment. The first time an heir had begun to grasp the full depth of the dark inheritance and bend it to their will rather than succumb. The princess stepped closer, each movement measured, deliberate, commanding attention and authority, and she focused on the cavity in the floor where the corpse had been hidden, visualizing the chamber not as a place of fear but as a crucible where she could forge her power, her mastery over the darkness. The whispers attempted to rise again, fragmented, accusing, probing, but she met them with an unwavering mind, reciting the symbolic phrase internally and externally, embedding it like a command in the very space around her. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. The creature's posture stiffened, a ripple of tension running through its malformed form, as though her words, her focus, her will, had begun to impose limits on its power, asserting a hierarchy it had not known since its creation. She felt her pulse synchronize with the tremor of the chamber, the rhythm of history embedded in the stones, and a subtle shift occurred. The shadows recoiled slightly, the floor's vibration steadied, the oppressive weight lifted just enough for her to feel the raw, intoxicating potential of control. It was terrifying and exhilarating, knowing that mastery required no weapons, only awareness, deliberate will, and the courage to confront the essence of every hidden, forbidden truth without flinching. In that suspended heartbeat, she understood fully. The descent into darkness was complete, yet in that descent lay the awakening of authority, the first step in shaping the forces that had long manipulated her world, bending fear into an instrument of power rather than allowing it to be her executioner. The princess exhaled slowly, letting the rhythm of her breath ground her as the creature hesitated, a trembling distortion of what once had been absolute authority over the shadows, the chamber, and the secrets of the palace. She stepped forward deliberately, feeling the pulse of centuries beneath her feet, every stone a reminder of the power that had been stored, hidden, suppressed, and now, within her grasp. The whispers tried to rise again, but she met them with the full force of recognition and will, repeating the symbolic phrase under her breath and aloud, a mantra that anchored her identity and projected authority into the very space around her. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. The creature recoiled subtly, its malformed limbs twitching like reflections on disturbed water, as if uncertain how to proceed against someone who no longer feared the darkness but had begun to command it. The king's gaze never left her, a mixture of awe, dread, and relief flickering across his features, realizing that this was the moment where an heir truly embraced the weight of bloodline, horror, and hidden truths, transforming inherited terror into deliberate power. The princess's mind was razor-sharp, mapping every threat, every angle, every whisper of manipulation, and she realized the chamber, the corpse, the entity itself, had been designed not merely to punish but to educate, to awaken an awareness so complete it could either break or empower. She raised her hand slowly, not to strike, but to assert dominion, and the creature responded in kind, a subtle pull backward, the shadows recoiling in acknowledgement of her command. A thrill surged through her, icy and intoxicating, the recognition that she could bend the currents of centuries-old fear without yielding to it. The whispers fractured further, repeating disjointed fragments of accusation and guilt, and she repeated the phrase again, firmly, deliberately, allowing it to resonate through every corner, every stone, every echo of the palace. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. The air thickened, then shifted, heavy oppression lifting slightly as if history itself was bending to her will. In that moment, she realized that the descent, the horror, the confrontation with every hidden and forbidden truth of her bloodline, had reached a turning point. She had survived, she had anchored herself, and she had claimed the first measure of mastery. The creature hovered, uncertain, its whispers broken, its influence waning, and she understood fully that true control required no violence, only clarity, presence, and the courage to face the abyss while refusing to be consumed. The chamber felt alive in a new way, vibrating not with menace but with tension, as if the very stones were aware that the air had begun to bend the currents of centuries-old terror to her will. The princess stood unmoving, every nerve attuned to the subtle shifts in the air, the faint vibrations beneath her feet, the fragmented whispers that still clung to the edges of consciousness, testing her, probing for hesitation. The creature loomed, its malformed limbs twitching, its faceless mouth twitching as if it were learning a new rhythm, a new hierarchy, one dictated not by instinctual dominance but by deliberate presence and focus. Her heart pounded steadily, no longer in fear but as a metronome guiding her awareness, and she repeated the phrase again, a sharp, commanding declaration that echoed in the chamber and within her own mind. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. The creature's movement slowed, hesitation thickening its unnatural grace, and she realized that control did not come from confrontation alone but from unwavering acknowledgement of reality, clarity in perception, and mastery of the self under pressure so extreme it could fracture the strongest mind. The king's eyes, keen and calculating, followed every subtle motion, every flicker of shadow, understanding that what was happening was the forging of a mind capable of wielding darkness without succumbing to it. She extended a hand toward the creature, not to touch, but to assert presence, to project authority, and the shadows drew back, bending as if in recognition of a newfound command. Her pulse aligned with the tremor of the chamber, and for the first time, she felt the oppressive weight of the palace and its history as something malleable, something that responded to clarity, focus, and deliberate will rather than raw fear. The whispers fractured entirely, breaking into incoherent fragments, and she knew she had reached a turning point where mastery was no longer aspirational but tangible. The descent into horror had awakened the ability to manipulate the currents that had long controlled the royal bloodline. The creature tilted its head, uncertain, recognizing that it had been matched, perhaps surpassed, by someone who had seen the abyss and refused to yield. Shadows shrank, the tremor softened, and the air lightened just enough to allow her to breathe fully. Every inhalation a reinforcement of presence, every exhalation a silent declaration of dominion. She had become not merely a survivor but a sentinel, a conscious force capable of commanding history, fear, and forbidden knowledge without being consumed, standing at the threshold of full awakening, the next stage of transformation beckoning, deeper and more dangerous than she had yet imagined. The shadows shifted nervously around her, stretching and contracting as though aware that their former dominion was being questioned, and the princess felt the pulse of the palace beneath her feet resonate with her own heartbeat, a subtle rhythm linking her to centuries of hidden knowledge, bloodline power, and unspoken pacts. The creature wavered before her, limbs trembling, faceless mouth frozen mid-whisper, a reflection of hesitation it had never known, and she realized that mastery was no longer hypothetical. It was manifest, tangible, threaded through the stone, the air, the very vibrations of the room. Every whispered accusation, every memory of failure and guilt, had lost its edge. They had become fuel, a map of vulnerabilities she could now navigate with precision. She stepped closer, deliberate, eyes locked on the entity that had once ruled her terror, and felt the first true surge of authority flow through her veins, clarity sharpened by confrontation, fear transformed into understanding, knowledge wielded as both shield and weapon. The king remained behind her, silent, observing the subtle oscillations in the air, the shifting shadows, recognizing that this was the point of no return. The air had begun to integrate the darkness, bending it without succumbing, and the palace itself seemed to acknowledge the balance of power. Her lips parted, voice calm and commanding. You exist only within the limits I define. Your dominion ends where my will begins. The creature froze, a shiver running through its malformed body, and the whispers ceased entirely, replaced by a suffocating, expectant silence that pressed against her senses, daring her to falter. She inhaled deeply, letting the rhythm of her breath anchor her, each exhale radiating control outward, and visualized the entity as a projection of her own fear, a construct that thrived only in the absence of awareness and dominance. As the words of the symbolic phrase echoed silently in her mind, I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken, the air thickened, then began to settle, the oppressive weight of centuries of secrecy and forbidden acts responding to her mastery, bending, not breaking, under her presence. The creature recoiled slightly, unsure, disoriented, as if perceiving for the first time that it had been challenged not with force but with something far more potent, unwavering consciousness. Shadows shrank, tremors softened, and she felt a fierce, cold exhilaration as the first true step of transformation solidified. She had descended into the darkness, confronted it, and emerged not broken, but as an agent capable of wielding the forbidden knowledge, shaping the palace's hidden forces with nothing but presence, clarity, and unflinching will. The princess lifted a gaze higher, noticing the way shadows clung to the edges of the chamber, no longer merely creeping but seeming to recall, as if the palace itself recognized her growing dominion, and she realized that the entity before her was not a separate force, but a reflection of centuries of human faith, ambition, and secrecy crystallized into a single, living instrument. Each breath she drew fed the clarity tightening in her chest, anchoring her awareness to the subtle vibrations in the stone, to the faint echoes of whispers that had once controlled generations, and she felt a surge of audacious comprehension. Mastery was not about destroying this creature. No fleeing, no pleading. It was about commanding it through the undeniable presence of self. She extended her hand slowly, deliberately, imagining the pulses of fear and memory emanating from the chamber bending toward her will, and the entity wavered, limbs trembling, faceless mouth twitching as it realized for the first time that its influence could be contested. The king's eyes narrowed, shadowed in awe, as he watched the ancient forces, whispers, tremors, shadows, responding to her unflinching command, bending subtly to the rhythm of her resolve. The creature's whispers, once invasive and overpowering, fragmented entirely, now made background noise compared to the resonance of her own deliberate voice, echoing internally and externally. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken. She repeated it twice more, louder, embedding the phrase as a binding code into the chamber's consciousness, into the entity itself, an invisible mark of authority that would guide all subsequent interactions. The shadows contracted further, the tremor softened, and she sensed, with a chilling clarity, that the entity now moved only at her allowance, testing her perception, waiting for her command, vulnerable to the will she projected with unwavering focus. Her heartbeat aligned with the pulse of the palace, and a thrill of cold power coursed through her veins, the intoxicating, dangerous realization that she could now manipulate the forces that had for centuries dictated the rhythm of fear and obedience in this place. The chamber responded to her mind as much as her presence, walls seeming to breathe, shadows bending subtly, whispers dissolving entirely into silence, all acknowledging the heir who had descended fully into the forbidden, confronted the darkness, and emerged not merely surviving, but shaping it. In that suspended, electrified silence, she understood. The descent was complete, the transformation underway, and the next step would not just be survival, it would be full command, bending the ancient, hidden forces to the will of the only one brave enough to confront them without flinching. The princess felt the air itself bend around her, as though the chamber recognized her authority, the shadows shrinking and twisting in deference, the whispers reduced to faint, fragmented murmurs that no longer threatened but waited, testing, gauging, uncertain. The creature's malformed limbs trembled, hesitated, a subtle quiver of recognition rippling through its pale, elongated form, and she realized with a cold, intoxicating clarity that this was no longer a confrontation, it was a negotiation conducted entirely on her terms. Each heartbeat aligned with the pulse of the palace, resonating through the stones, the cracks, the centuries of hidden knowledge and forbidden acts, and she felt a surge of raw, dangerous awareness. She could bend history, guilt, memory, and fear itself without succumbing. The king, silent behind her, watched every movement with wide, calculating eyes, knowing that this moment marked a rare crossing. The air transformed fear into instrument, terror into leverage, knowledge into power. Her voice, low and deliberate, broke the charged silence. You exist only because I acknowledge you. Your dominion ends where my will begins. The creature froze, a subtle ripple moving through its body, faceless mouth twitching as if attempting to protest, to reclaim dominance, yet sensing for the first time that the rules had changed. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, extending her hand not to touch but to assert presence, her awareness projecting into every shadow, every tremor, every whisper, a tangible authority that rippled through the chamber. The symbolic phrase rang in her mind and her voice. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken, repeated again, a mantra and a code, a bond of power she was inscribing into the very space around her. Shadows contracted further, trembling under her mental pressure, and she sensed the entity recoiling, uncertain, fragmented, reliant now on her tolerance, her command, her focus. Every fragment of the palace, the floor, the stones, the hidden cavities, the whispers of centuries past, responded subtly, bending to her presence, acknowledging the heir who had descended into darkness and refused to surrender. A cold thrill ran through her veins, sharpened by the dangerous knowledge that mastery required not destruction but precise, unflinching attention, and that the forces which had haunted generations could now be steered, manipulated, and controlled by the one brave enough to confront them fully. The air vibrated with tense expectancy, shadows shrinking, whispers dissolving, as the princess stood at the threshold of complete ascendancy over the dark inheritance, fully aware that the next steps would deepen her power and cement her command over the forbidden forces now at her disposal. The princess stepped fully into the center of the chamber, the air thick with the weight of centuries of suppressed fear, yet responding to her with a subtle, almost reverent tremor, and she realized that this was no longer a room of terror. It was a crucible, a living map of power waiting for her command. Shadows curled and recoiled as she moved, twisting around her presence, no longer threatening but attentive, as if seeking guidance, acknowledging the shift in authority. The creature, pale, elongated, faceless, and grotesque, hovered uncertainly, its limbs quivering, every motion tentative, recognizing that the rules had changed irrevocably. She inhaled deeply, letting the rhythm of her heartbeat align with the pulse of the chamber, the vibrations of stone and air merging into a single, coherent wave that she could navigate and direct. Her voice, steady, cold, and commanding, rang through the oppressive space. "You exist only within the parameters I define. You bend only as I allow." The entity froze, limbs twitching, faceless mouth attempting expression but failing, sensing for the first time that dominance was no longer its privilege, but her prerogative. Repeating the symbolic phrase aloud, "I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken," she felt it solidify not merely in the air but inside her own consciousness, a tangible assertion of power that rippled through the chamber, through the stones, the shadows, and the echoes of long-forgotten pacts. The king's expression softened, a mixture of awe, relief, and dread, as he watched the transformation unfold, knowing that the heir was no longer prey to history, but an active agent capable of directing it. The shadows began to bend subtly around her, moving in response to her presence and will, while the creature's movements became hesitant, controlled, and reactive rather than instinctive, as if acknowledging her authority. Every breath she took reinforced her mastery, each exhale consolidating the threads of power she now wielded, and she realized with exhilarating terror that she could manipulate not through force but through perception, presence, and the precise assertion of will. The whispers of centuries past, once invasive and overwhelming, now clung weakly, fragmented and awaiting instruction, while the chamber itself seemed to pulse with obedience, acknowledging her command over the darkness that had haunted generations. In that charged, trembling silence, the princess understood fully. The descent into horror had ended not with submission, but with awakening, and the first true mastery of forbidden knowledge and hidden power had been claimed. The princess moved deliberately through the chamber, each step measured, aware that her presence alone now dictated the rhythm of shadows, the tremor of the stones, and the lingering whispers of generations past. The creature, once an unchallenged force of fear and memory, now moved cautiously, its every limb responding to her intent rather than its own will, a grotesque marionette tethered to her awareness. She extended a hand slowly, visualizing the currents of energy flowing beneath the palace floor, threading through every hidden cavity, every secret passage, every whisper of forbidden knowledge, and felt them bend subtly toward her, acknowledging her authority. Her voice, steady, deliberate, commanding, filled the space. "The darkness serves where I demand it. The past obeys where I direct it." The symbolic phrase reverberated in her mind, inscribed into the very architecture of thought and space. "I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken." Shadows shrank and twisted in subtle homage, curling toward her fingertips as if sensing the mental web she had begun to weave. The king observed silently, eyes wide with awe and tempered fear, recognizing the transformation that had taken place. The heir had moved beyond confrontation into control, the forbidden knowledge now a tool of her making rather than a weapon aimed at her. She breathed slowly, synchronizing her pulse with the tremor of the chamber, each inhale solidifying her mental dominion, each exhale dispersing the last remnants of hesitation and fear. The whispers, once invasive, now existed only as threads she could pluck at will, guiding their direction and strength, bending their resonance to the cadence of her thought. The creature's faceless head tilted unnaturally, limbs twitching with uncertainty, no longer a predator but a cautious participant, aware that its dominance had been replaced by hers. A shiver of cold, intoxicating exhilaration ran through her veins as she realized the full scope of her awakening, She could now manipulate memory, fate, history, and perception within these walls, bending the currents of centuries-old pacts and hidden knowledge without lifting a weapon, without spilling blood, relying solely on awareness, presence, and will. The air itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with her resolve, the chamber responding to her command like a living instrument, and for the first time, she felt the intoxicating, dangerous exhilaration of true power. Control not over men alone, but over the shadows, secrets, and forbidden currents that had haunted her family for generations. In that charged silence, she understood the terrifying truth. Mastery over fear and history required no allies, no tools, only the unwavering courage to confront, command, and bend darkness to the will of one who refused to yield. The princess raised her hand slowly, palms outward, as if drawing the very currents of the palace toward her, and the shadows responded, curling and bending in subtle acknowledgement, a silent testament to the shift in power. The creature's grotesque, elongated limbs twitched nervously, its faceless mouth frozen mid-whisper, and she realized fully that it now existed only within the boundaries she defined, its influence limited by her presence and focus. Every whisper of centuries past, the hidden pacts, the buried secrets, the atrocities long concealed, were now threads she could manipulate, weaving them into patterns of control that stretched from the stone floors beneath her feet to the high ceilings above, threading through every crevice of the chamber, every pulse of the palace. Her voice, low, steady, and commanding, resonated with deliberate clarity. The darkness is mine to guide, the past mine to direct, the shadows mine to bend. Each word reinforced her sovereignty. Each repetition of the symbolic phrase, I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken, cementing the authority she now held over forces that had once dominated her bloodline. The king, silent and tense, watched with a mixture of awe and fear, understanding that the heir had passed beyond survival into full dominion, capable of shaping fate, memory, and forbidden knowledge with nothing but awareness and intent. She moved deliberately around the chamber, eye scanning every shadow, every irregularity in the stone, every whisper of sound, sensing the currents of energy that once controlled generations now bending subtly toward her will. The creature followed her motions hesitantly, limbs twitching, its presence diminished, acknowledging her command, while the palace itself seemed to pulse in resonance with her focus. Her heartbeat aligned perfectly with the tremor of the stone, each breath a tool, each thought a lever to manipulate the unseen forces around her. The realization struck her with thrilling terror. She could wield history, fear, and darkness without weapon or violence, commanding obedience through clarity and presence alone. The whispers of the past, once overwhelming, now danced lightly around her, pliant, obedient, waiting for direction, their potency harnessed rather than feared. In the charged silence that followed, she felt a profound, intoxicating exhilaration, terrifying in its scope, but exhilarating in its revelation. The descent had ended, but the awakening had only begun. She had become not merely an heir, but a force capable of bending centuries of secrets, shadows, and forbidden currents to her will, standing at the threshold of a power that no living being, no ghost, no curse could challenge as long as she remained resolute and unbroken. The princess stood motionless in the center of the chamber, feeling the pulse of the palace sync with her own heartbeat, a rhythm that carried centuries of suppressed fear, hidden pacts, and unspoken crimes, now bending subtly to her will. Shadows curled at her feet, then along the walls, shifting obediently with the slightest gesture, and the creature, grotesque and unnatural, trembled with uncertainty, its faceless mouth frozen, elongated limbs twitching in hesitant recognition. Every fragment of the palace, the cold stone, the faint vibrations underfoot, the hidden chambers, the echoes of centuries of secrecy, responded to her presence, acknowledging the shift in hierarchy. Her voice, low, deliberate, and commanding, cut through the thick, expectant air. All that once controlled me now bends under my awareness. The darkness answers to me. The symbolic phrase, repeated silently and aloud, I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken, became not just words but a seal of dominion, embedding itself in the chamber, in the whispers, in the creature's fractured attention, a chain of authority linking her mind, body, and the palace itself. The king observed from the shadows, recognizing the transformation taking place. The heir had moved beyond confrontation, beyond survival, and into the territory of true mastery, where the invisible forces that had shaped history, fear, and corruption could now be bent, guided, and redirected. The creature, once a predator of terror, now followed her motions with tentative precision, a reflection of obedience, recognizing that its power had shifted irrevocably. She breathed slowly, each inhalation anchoring her, each exhale projecting authority, until the whispers of the past, once overwhelming, became pliant, threads she could pull, twist, and weave into patterns of her making. A shiver of icy exhilaration ran through her, sharp and intoxicating, as she realized the depth of her control. She could command the currents of fear, manipulate memory, and shape the hidden forces that had haunted her family for generations, all without lifting a weapon, all without violence, relying solely on presence, clarity, and will. The air quivered, the shadows shifted once more, and the chamber itself seemed to recognize the completion of the first stage of her ascension. She had descended fully into darkness, confronted it, and emerged not only unbroken, but as a master of the forbidden, a force capable of bending centuries-old secrets to her command, standing on the precipice of a transformation that no living being, or ghost, could challenge. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as the princess advanced, every step deliberate, each movement radiating authority, and she felt the palace itself respond to her presence, the shadows curling and shrinking, whispers bending to her focus, and the creature's limbs trembling with uncertainty. She realized that the room was no longer a prison of fear but a theater of power, a crucible where the currents of history, darkness, and hidden knowledge converged and could be directed by those willing to seize mastery. The creature loomed, grotesque and faceless, a specter of centuries-old terror, yet hesitant, uncertain, waiting, as if it recognized that its influence had shifted, that obedience now hinged on her will rather than instinctual fear. The king, watching silently, felt the pulse of awe and dread coiling around him. He knew he was witnessing an unprecedented transformation, a convergence of clarity, courage, and dangerous awareness, and that the air had crossed a threshold few ever reached. Her voice rang out, calm, commanding, deliberate. You exist only because I allow it. Your power is limited by my presence, your influence contained by my awareness. The symbolic phrase echoed again, repeated with precision and focus. I obey the shadow, and I remain unbroken, a mantra that tethered her authority not only to herself but to the very architecture of the palace, embedding control into the walls, the shadows, and the hidden recesses where centuries of secrecy had festered. The creature paused, mid-motion, a ripple of hesitation passing through its malformed body, recognizing for the first time that it no longer held dominion, that its whispers, its terrors, were now instruments she could shape. The shadows contracted further, coiling tightly like obedient serpents, and the chamber vibrated subtly with the resonance of her will, aligning stone, air, and entity with her focus. She breathed in sync with the pulse of the room, inhaling awareness, exhaling authority, and felt the exhilarating terror of power coursing through her veins, the intoxicating knowledge that she could manipulate history, fear, and forbidden forces without confrontation, without bloodshed, relying solely on perception, clarity, and unflinching will. The palace, the creature, the shadows, all responded to her mental command, acknowledging the heir who had descended fully into darkness and emerged not broken, but as a sovereign of forbidden knowledge, standing at the edge of ultimate mastery, ready to bend the hidden currents of history itself to her intent. The princess paused in the center of the chamber, letting the silence stretch, thick and expectant, as if the palace itself awaited her final assertion, and she felt the shadows tighten around her, quivering, anticipating the will that had now become absolute. The creature's malformed limbs trembled, its faceless head tilting unnaturally, as if sensing the irreversible shift. It was no longer predator, but subject, bound to the rhythm of her awareness and authority. Every whisper, every vibration in the stone, every echo of centuries of hidden pacts and unspoken horrors responded to her presence, bending subtly yet undeniably, acknowledging the heir who had descended fully into darkness and refused to be consumed. Her voice, calm, resonant, and commanding, pierced the chamber. Everything that once held power over me now bends to my awareness. Shadows, whispers, fear, they exist only within the limits I define. She repeated the symbolic phrase once more, aloud and in thought. I bear the shadow, and I remain unbroken, letting it resonate like a pulse that threaded through the stones, the shadows, the creature itself. The air thickened, then shifted, vibrating in perfect alignment with her heartbeat, and she sensed for the first time the intoxicating breadth of control. Every hidden current, every suppressed memory, every secret embedded in these walls, now under her authority, responsive to her focus. The creature quivered, uncertain, halting mid-motion, aware that its dominion was gone, replaced by a hierarchy it had never known. Shadows receded, curling toward the edges of the chamber like obedient serpents, the whispers fractured, pliant and awaiting instruction, the palace itself seeming to breathe under her mastery. She stepped forward deliberately, hand raised, not to strike, but to assert presence, to radiate control, and felt the thrill of dangerous, intoxicating power surge through her veins, the awareness that she could bend darkness, fear, and history without bloodshed, relying solely on mind, will, and precision. The king watched silently, awe and terror mingled in his gaze, understanding that the heir had achieved a level of mastery that few could comprehend, descending fully into the abyss, confronting every hidden, forbidden truth, and emerging not broken, but sovereign over forces that had haunted generations. In that suspended, electrified silence, the princess knew she had claimed her dominion. The shadows, the whispers, the palace itself, and the creature were hazed to guide, bend, and shape, and nothing, neither fate, history, nor the dark inheritance of blood and secrecy, could challenge her unbroken will. The chamber fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that presses against the bones, and the princess stood alone, though not alone. The shadows, the whispers, the creature, the pulse of centuries of secrecy, all lingered, bound to her presence, awaiting her intent. She raised her head, eyes sharp, cold, commanding, and felt the exhilarating, terrifying weight of mastery settle fully upon her shoulders. She was no longer an heir struggling to survive the horrors of the past, but a sovereign of the forbidden, a force capable of bending darkness, fear, and history itself with nothing but will and awareness. The creature shivered, a grotesque reflection of the past, now diminished, a tool of observation rather than terror, its malformed limbs trembling with obedience, its faceless mouth frozen, unable to utter threats that had once dominated entire generations. The shadows retreated slightly, curling like coiled serpents along the edges, whispering not in fear but in anticipation, waiting for her direction. She spoke, her voice low, deliberate, each word a pulse that reverberated through stone and air like. Every secret, every hidden act, every fear and memory that has bound this palace, this bloodline, this